Well, let's talk about a few more topics in this economics of information chapter before we're done. We're almost done. One thing is insurance companies in figuring out prices that they need to charge different types of drivers in order to make a reasonable amount of money and not drive away their customers either. They often float different prices to different types of individual. And this is because when you apply for insurance, you may be the best driver in the world, but they really don't know that. You know, but they don't. And so what's going to happen is, and you could tell them you're a great driver, but that's not a credible threat. And you're too young to have much of a history, so you could have just been lucky. So what they do is they use statistical discrimination, lacking information, good information on you individually. They use they float you a price based on the category that you fit in. And that's really unfortunate if you're a young male under the age of 25, and you may be a great driver, but the fact is young males under the age of 25 are really stupid behind the wheel. They're just full of testosterone, and they're involved in a lot of accidents. They get competitive, they drive when they're drinking more than other people do, and they're just a terrible risk. And so you may not be, but you get that same rate. And all sorts of things. We see statistical discrimination in many areas of the economy. We see Harvard graduates get offered higher salaries than Pacific University graduates, even with the same test scores. And simply because these Harvard graduates, there's a higher likelihood that they're just brilliant and knockout smart, and that's a better category. So they get a better offer. Anyway, when you base a decision, and typically it's a quantitative price or salary or something like that, when that's based in some measure on the category of a person, that's called statistical discrimination, and it's necessary when we're trying to make guesses about things we don't really know about. Another concept in this economics of information chapter, in particular the economics of insurance, is adverse selection. And I was trying to figure out a way to bring in Woody Allen's quote that he'd never belonged to a club that would have him as a member. But anyway, I can't. I'm tired. It's Saturday evening, and I need to go home and have supper. But anyway, one example, let's just go back to that insurance example. Let's suppose you were the insurance company that's going to treat young males fairly, and you're going to just offer them a flat fee, the same rate as old males and old females and young females. You're just going to have one premium fits all, and it'll just be an average of every driver. Well, here's the thing. If you're that 53-year-old male that's never been in an accident in, close to 40 years of driving, and suddenly your company is telling you, oh, we're going to be fair in charging prices, and we're going to raise your rates so we can lower the rates to these other drivers who are in different categories. Well, I'm out of there. I'm going to the company that's going to reward my life of good driving. And who's going to be left in such a company that's offering this kind of a rate structure? Well, the people that are going to be left are the people for whom the average is a good deal, and that's going to be all the bad drivers. The good drivers are going to be able to get a lower premium than average, and they're going to go get that. I've got a picture of a health insurance situation. That's what the image is supposed to convey. Turns out with health insurance, there's an adverse selection problem. Let's say you have a really expensive but super high amenity health insurance plan. Well, if I'm young and healthy, I don't smoke, don't drink much, I exercise a lot, I'm very cautious, frankly, I'm not interested in buying the really high cost, high amenity health insurance plan. So who is? People that are very likely to get sick and need those services. For the rest of us, it's a bad deal, but for those people, it's a good deal. So who's left buying such an insurance policy? while the sick and the people that are precisely the people that are likely to incur the highest costs. And it's not a good situation for an insurance company. And that's not to say adverse selection situations happen all the time, but they do happen, and it's especially the case when we don't know, or an insurance company doesn't know who's a healthy person and who's not, or sometimes they're prohibited by law. The law in the United States required that people that get their insurance through their companies get offered a group premium rate. That's not been the case until the Affordable Care Act for individuals buying individual insurance. So it's some of the changes made by the Obamacare legislation are meant to address some of the problems that are created when we have this system of adverse selection in the market for insurance policies. Young and healthy people that choose not to get insurance, or used to before Obamacare, they sometimes do get into accidents, and it can be very, very expensive for them and for society if they don't have reasonable health insurance coverage. Oh, and then another concept that comes up here is moral hazard, and this is a concept that we see over and over in human behavior. And the fact is that people take risks more often when they are insured against the bad outcomes of those risks. Just a silly example, we didn't see a decline in the overall fatality rate when seatbelts became mandatory. We didn't see the decline in overall fatality rates from automobiles when airbags became the standard. The reason is, and we have these insurance actuaries to tell us, is that when the probability of surviving any given accident went up, as it did with seatbelts and airbags, people started driving more recklessly. So while their chances of surviving any given accident were much lower, they got in so many more accidents that the net effect on fatalities was close to zero. This is an example of moral hazard of a type. Another example, the one I've chosen my image from, is that if we have a situation where if banks get into trouble, the federal government comes in and bails them out, as has happened, not just in this recent Great Recession episode with the TARP, but there was a long-term capital management was a case 10 or 15 years before that. Government stepped in and saved this group of financial firms that had gotten themselves into a situation that would have ended up with their failing had the government not stepped in. Anyway, the problem, one of the problems with the government stepping in like that, and I'm not saying it's necessarily the wrong thing to have done, but even the regulators that stepped in and rescued the banks worried about the moral hazard problem that would result. And that is that if banks know that if they get into really bad trouble and would be insolvent, if in that case the government's going to step in and rescue them, well, then they don't have to worry about that downside risk. So they might be more inclined, and certainly we've seen banks be more inclined in the past to take on more risky assets in their portfolio. And that would be a real problem for taxpayers and for well, mainly for taxpayers, I guess, that are bailing out those banks. But those financial intermediaries are supposed to be pricing risk appropriately. And if risky assets are priced too cheaply, well, then we have a misallocation of resources in the economy, and that can be real bad for the whole economy. And then finally, I want to touch on this theory of disappearing political discourse. Last Thursday, Ron Wyden was on Pacific's campus, and I'm going to use this screencast for future courses, I expect. So this is, I'm talking about November 1st, 2014 is when I'm talking at this moment. Anyway, Ron Wyden was on campus last weekend, and he's chair of the Finance Committee, at least until the Democrats lose control of the Senate, as is forecast to happen on Tuesday. And, he's in a position you'd think you could have a discussion with him on a lot of issues. including on sensible corporate tax reform, which is actually a big problem in the United States. But he didn't, and I used to work in Washington, D.C., and politicians really are careful about, in a public group, they just don't talk about substance if it's an issue that's at all controversial. So just my example is corporate tax rates, and the U.S. has the worst corporate tax structure of any country in the world, arguably. Maybe not any country in the world, but most countries do better than we do. We have the highest corporate tax rates, so those corporate taxes are creating the biggest disincentives on certain types of behavior. But then we also have the lowest actual tax rate paid among rich countries, and that means we collect the least revenue. So we're getting the worst of all possible worlds. Well, clearly, any economist that's looked at this has concluded that we absolutely need to lower corporate tax rates and close loopholes. So we have a smaller disincentive and potentially even greater revenues. But for a guy like Wyden, who's a Democrat, and people make their voting decisions based on sound bites. For a guy like Wyden to come out and say, hey, we need to lower corporate tax rates, well, suddenly he's the guy, he's the corporate the pawn that he can't stand up and look out for the interests of the people. And even though he'd be in the right, he's not going to say that, because in a soundbite world, in a world where people are making their decisions based on soundbite, he can't risk that soundbite where he says, yes, we should lower corporate tax rates, because that's his base is going to say, what? How can this guy be giving it up for the corporate interest and screwing the little people? That's just wrong, and we're going to vote for whoever's going to run against him. So this is happening all over the map, right, left, and it results in a situation that's very difficult to get political figures engaged in substantial argument. They just are too careful not to say anything of substance. And it's a real shame. As an economist, I want to hear talk about policy, but boy, you just don't get it from the people that are supposed to be managing policy. And we know why. It's in this economics of information. So a guy that, actually Wyden's probably a guy that could bring about, or Merkley even better. He's got a real liberal voting record. He's the guy whose credibility among his base is so high that he's actually a guy that, if he were so inclined, could get corporate tax rates lower, or could perhaps get it. Anyway, this is a problem of our political system in the United States. Other political systems, parliamentary systems, where if you get 2% of the vote, you get 2% of the seats, maybe it's not such a problem, but it sure is in the United States.